So tonight we'll be evaluating Jimmy Carter, his beliefs, and his disastrous foreign policy legacy. Frontline Fellowship grew out of Rhodesia, and Jimmy Carter played a special role in betraying our country. The passing away of President Jimmy Carter has led many to consider his presidential legacy. Joe Biden claimed that President Carter was a role model. Well, certainly he's his role model, we can see that, but I don't know if he's a role model for the rest of us. Others have declared that Jimmy Carter was a champion of peace, human rights, and justice, and that he globalized the human rights movement. Well, the last term is true. He did globalize the human rights movement, but it was a very hypocritical, confused one. Here's Jimmy Carter about to hug the head of Hamas. So if you really stand for human rights, what do? You embrace and hug the leader of Hamas. President Ronald Reagan pointed out during his famous debate with Jimmy Carter in 1980 that Jimmy Carter's foreign policy was hypocritical. He targeted American allies who were accused of being authoritarian and infringing on human rights. In context, let's remember, those very countries were fighting for their lives, seeking to protect the countries from communist terrorism and aggression. While Jimmy Carter's administration was maintaining friendly relations with the Soviet Union and challenging vast amounts of US aid to the most totalitarian state on earth, the Soviet Union, where there was, as Ronald Reagan said, no respect for human rights at all. So in the name of human rights, they betrayed the allies, and yet he could be on kissing terms with the dictator of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, under whom millions of religious people were locked up in the Gulag, in concentration camps. And not to mention that they were sowing landmines in Afghanistan, like the butterfly bombs. Have you ever heard of the butterfly bombs? The Soviet planes would litter the field with butterfly bombs. They're plastic with a bit of liquid explosive. And if a boot steps in it, nothing happens. But if bare feet step in it, it explodes. Plastic shrapnel into the feet. So under Brezhnev, they were sowing millions of these mines in Afghanistan designed to blow the feet off barefoot indigenous Afghan tribespeople. And because it's plastic shrapnel, you can't see it on x-rays, therefore they had to amputate the foot. They couldn't save the foot because the plastic would go seriously septic. Some sick soul in the Politburo thought up this kind of thing, and under Brezhnev, Jimmy Carter's kissing cousin, they were happy to sow these things in Afghanistan. Now, it's disturbing that Jimmy Carter, who claimed to be a born-again Christian, claimed Imagine was his favorite song. In fact, Jimmy Carter chose to have Imagine played at his wife's funeral, and he requested to be played at his funeral, which was just this month. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. Well, I couldn't imagine no heaven personally, but no hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Not living for eternity, living for today. Imagine there's no countries. Well, what's that? That's the globalist New World disorder. It's not hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. This is the one world order. This is the anthem of communists and atheists around the world. Why would a born-again Christian choose to resonate with an atheist, communist, anti-Christian message like that promoted in Imagine? I might say Babylon B's got a much better version of this. Imagine all the people living in the Gulag. And I think if you get a chance, check out Babylon B website and imagine all the people living in the Gulag. That's far more accurate. Also concerning is Jimmy Carter was on record as being in support of gay marriage. Now this is long before Obama or Biden took a pro-gay marriage position. I put gay marriage in inverted commas because there is no such thing. God defines what's marriage. And marriage can only be between a man and a woman, one man, one woman for life, a loving partnership. And gay marriage is, in the Bible, described as an abomination. There's no way it can be a marriage. So when a person says, do you believe in gay marriage? You can say there's no such thing. Governments don't get to define what marriage is. The Creator does. And He's defined it in the Bible. So that's the issue. So I'm not saying there's such thing as gay marriage. I'm just saying He supported what they call gay marriage. To be more radical, to be further to the left than Obama and Biden is hard to imagine. But Carter was even more radical, even more to the left than those leftist radicals as Biden and Obama, who, by the way, are called Carter 2 and Carter 3. Jimmy Carter even argued that people outside of Christ can get to heaven and that Jesus is not essential to salvation. This is a Baptist Sunday school teacher. You don't need Jesus to get to heaven. There are good people in every religion. People of every religion are going to get to heaven. Now, there's a few things wrong with that statement. First of all, Jesus said no one is good except God alone. So for Jimmy Carter teaches a lot of good people in all religions, it's wrong, 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 wrong. If I've got to choose between Jimmy Carter and Jesus, there's just no contest, obviously. Acts 4 verse 12 says, salvation is found in no one else. There's no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. John 14 verse 6, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. We are lost. Jesus is the way. We are deceived. Jesus is the truth. We are dead in our trespasses, and Jesus is the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through Jesus. Jimmy Carter was a bad Sunday school teacher, not just a bad president. Jimmy Carter also claimed to be personally pro-life, but he opposed any attempt to reverse Roe v. Wade court decision, which effectively means he is practically pro-choice, i.e. pro-abortion. So, seriously, what's with a pro-perversion, pro-abortion president who's born again, who loves Imagine song where there'd be no religion, no heaven, seriously, no borders, no countries, no possessions, by the way, remember? You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. That's the Imagine theme song. Now, in Africa, we don't see Jimmy Carter as a force for peace, human rights, or justice at all. Referring to President Jimmy Carter, Jonas Savimbi, the courageous leader of the UNITA freedom fighters in Angola, commented, it is better to be America's enemy than to be America's friend. If you're America's enemy, you will probably be bought. If you're America's friend, you will certainly be sold. I can never forget having breakfast at Jumba, headquarters for UNITA Free Angola in southeastern Angola in Coanda-Kabanga province. I'd taken in a group of American guests, and to entertain our American guests, Jonas Savimbi was quoting from Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Plainly, he understood America, its constitution, its founding fathers very well. He wasn't anti-American. He was speaking about Jimmy Carter's State Department. And it's certainly true, Jonas Savimbi spoke from personal experience, that pro-Western Christian Angolans certainly were betrayed by Jimmy Carter's State Department and by the CIA. And he made another joke. Jonas Savimbi said, do you know why there hasn't been a revolution in America in over 200 years? All Americans around the table were looking a bit confused. He said, there's no American embassy in America. All the Africans are laughing, and all the Americans are looking confused. Well, the Africans know American embassies are often at the heart of revolutions, not just in Africa, in Iran too, all over South America. How many times has the US embassy been the hotbed for the revolution? In fact, it was proved by the Citizen that the US embassy in South Africa was fomenting the revolution at the start of 1976. In Soweto, they had a reading room, a US embassy reading room, open, of course, to the average person in Soweto. It's got nothing to do with America or American citizens. And they did an analysis. The books were not of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or anything like that. It was all Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh. The American embassy had films, videos, and books, comics, newsletters, totally, utterly, thoroughly communist revolution. In fact, the US embassy aided and abetted and fueled the revolution in South Africa. There's no question about it. It was well documented. So Jonas Savimbi, I think, made a lot of good points that morning breakfast. For people who don't know where Angola is, southwestern Africa, what the Portuguese called Portuguese West Africa. And Jimmy Carter did betray the Angolan freedom fighters. One of our good friends was Colonel Des Radmore. Colonel Des Radmore actually did the Jane's Defense Weekly supplements, and he would often be able to present to the world the stats for new Russian technology, like the first multiple grenade launchers that were found, tripod fired. He captured the first SAM missiles, SAM-8 missiles in Angola, and let the rest of the world, especially the West, know the specs of this. In fact, the South Africans later adapted a shoulder-held and fired multiple grenade launcher, which was Des Radmore's design, based on the ideas he got from the tripod-based multiple grenade launcher of the Russians. And he testified to me that he was the coordinating person between the Southwest African Territorial Force, the SADF, UNITA, FNLA, and the American CIA, as well as the Congo government, I should say Zaire government at that stage, of Mobutu Sese Seko. He said he can testify not one single usable weapon was provided by the US government through the whole time of the Angolan Civil War. He'd be in Congo receiving the C-130s arriving and offloading crates of weapons. He said they never, ever supplied the right ammunition for the weapons. The ammo literally had to be just dumped because it couldn't be used. The weapons were absolutely unusable. Once when they got a whole lot of 80mm mortars, he tried to use them. He could not use these 82mm mortars, none of them, because there was something wrong with it. They tried every possible thing. In the end, they had to open up the sealed unit with a firing pin. The firing pins had been removed from the sealed units. This could not be an accident, he said. The Americans were deliberately shipping out tons of useless weaponry to FNLA and UNITA so that they could say to Congress, we delivered so many tons of weapons to Congo for the freedom fighters in Angola, which Congress had mandated, but not one of them was of any use. So Colonel Des Radmore said, the US were treacherous, backstabbing scum. Just quote unquote. He's absolutely sickened by it. He said the Americans could pour who knows how much money those flights cost and the risks to the pilots and all that, just to offload useless equipment that was good for nothing except a statistic saying, well, we delivered so many tons. So like those people who deliver Bibles to Africa that can't be read. You get people who get things printed in China because China can print Bibles cheaper than anyone else. The only problem is you can't read them unless you've got microscopes and magnifying glasses because the text is so small. If you ever get these unreadable text Bibles, they're produced by China to sell to people who don't care if it's usable or not, but just so they can say, we bought 10,000 Bibles, we delivered so many tons of Bibles. They're absolutely useless. You cannot use them. I was asking when somebody had spoken about delivering 40,000 Bibles in a container to Angola, to Sudan, I thought that's not possible. You can only fit 10,000 Bibles in a container because each Bible, like the ones we've got in our display cabinet downstairs, is a kilogram. A good Bible is a kilogram weight. Well, these, I asked our folks to bring a copy from Sudan. They brought one down, weighed it 40 grams. We open up, well, of course, this was printed in China. You can't read it. It's such small script. So if you are wanting maximum amount of Bibles for the cheapest price, China can do it for you, but they won't be readable. Nobody can read that sort of script. You might even have 3 columns. And these Chinese Bibles we get, it's a typical way of saying we produced and distribute so many Bibles. The only problem is you can't read them. And that's the way they work. So the Russians were supplying real weapons that actually fired with actual ammunition to the Cubans and the Angolan communists, whereas America was providing useless dead weight that's only good for you to use for building up muscle mass while you run around with something of equivalent weight to a real rifle. But aside from rifle PT, they were absolutely useless for actually fighting. Now, the Portuguese had a revolution and the socialists took over and they decided to abandon their overseas possessions. Portugal had been in Africa for 500 years. They just fled, and people fled to the airport, leaving the food on the stove, washing on the line, and when they get there, they had to abandon virtually all their luggage anyway, as TAP flew them to Portugal. And others drove through to Southwest Africa. Hundreds of thousands of people who might have been for generations in Angola, Portuguese West Africa, just fled overnight. And the Soviets moved in battleships into Luanda Harbor, started offloading the tanks, trucks, helicopter gunships, weaponry of high sort. Heads of the Warsaw Pact were in Angola. This is taken in Luanda as the Russians came to hand over to Fidel Castro, the newest colony. And just what the Americans are doing in Ukraine, Russia was doing in Angola. They were fighting a proxy war, using the Cubans to do their dirty work for them. But we all knew we were fighting the Russians, even though it was the Cubans and the Angolan communists doing the work. But it was Russian weapons. And Anthony can testify to that. I mean, he took one of those main bases where all the weapons came from the Soviet Union. You knew you were fighting Russia, even if the Russians weren't personally there. Just like in Ukraine, people know they're fighting America and NATO, even if the Americans and NATO people aren't actually there at that time. And so Fidel Castro in Angola, with the drunken, psychotic Marxist poet Agostinho Neto and Angolan flag, Agostinho Neto said, "I will destroy the Bible. Within 20 years, you'll have to go to a museum to see what a Bible looks like. I've destroyed the Bible." Well, I'm glad to say our mission proved him a false prophet. We smuggled more Bibles into Angola than there had been when he made that false prophecy. And yes, the Cubans marched there with Che Guevara's ugly mug. Amazing how many stupid Christians wear Che Guevara's t-shirt. I mean, that's a drunken, dirty drug addict, psychotic bank robber, a real psycho. I mean, he boasted of killing 4,000 people, including women and children. Not in battle, shooting them dead in the fort in Havana, Cuba. So he was a real mass murdering thug. For Christians to wear a t-shirt with that mass murdering thug, but then I've seen Christians wearing Vladimir Lenin and Mao Zedong t-shirts too. So, I mean, they're all just as bad. And missiles, yep, they had missiles in Angola too. The Soviets were moving in. And here you've got a South African army captured photograph showing Russians training the communist SWAPO and ANC in Angola. And you've got the Marx Brothers pictures on the wall. Engels, Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, Dos Santos, the Angolan president. And this is the flag of Vietnam. It's a communist who's who in Angola. This picture is a little set up. They actually had to move the Fidel Castro and Brezhnev pictures over here, just so you could see the South African officer and troop outside. It's a South African raid. And you can see the SWAPO and other communist insignia on the walls, including the Soviet rank structure. That's a Soviet P-76 amphibious armored vehicle outside. Angola was a colony of the communists, and all the industry was nationalized. Do you know, the communists nationalized everything, right down to laundromats. And extraordinary, they even made a losing concern of diamond mining. Can you imagine they could make a losing concern of mining diamonds? But when the government nationalizes things, that's what can happen. Diamond mining even became unprofitable when the MP line nationalized it all. They nationalized the bus service, nationalized the train service. And so in the end, the people just left with bicycles, if they were lucky, to transport everything. They broke the National Bank. This is the National Bank of Angola in Anjiva. Looks like somebody made a withdrawal. Looks like Anthony recognized the place. Yeah. You didn't do this, though, did you? And here's Huambo, second largest city in Angola, and people are walking, carrying buckets of water. Why? Well, it's a communist-controlled city, so you can't expect plumbing to work, can you? So they've nationalized plumbing, so obviously you've got to walk and get buckets of water. It's only the second largest city in the country. And this is what communism can do for a country. The Portuguese built actually quite a nice civilization in Angola, but the communists destroyed it in about a year. And that's what you could see from there, just bombed out, shot out buildings. Well, Jimmy Carter's foreign policy was disastrous for the persecuted church. Ideas have consequences. Exhibit A, the betrayal of the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran testified of the treachery of Jimmy Carter's State Department. President Reagan repeatedly stated it was America's misguided policies. Personally, I think Ronald Reagan was being too kind. I don't think it was misguided. Now, I'll tell you why. Again, quoting our friend Jonas Savimbi, if you make a mistake, we're human. Everyone makes a mistake. You make the same mistake twice, you're stupid. You make the same mistake 5, 6, 10, 20 times, you've got a hidden agenda. Nobody's that stupid. If the US State Department was just stupid, they'd do the right thing sometimes just by random chance. This has to be intentional. So I think Ronald Reagan was being too kind to say America's policies in Iran were misguided. I think it was intentionally treacherous, personally. But Reagan said it was the US State Department's policies that caused the fall of the late Shah, calling it an historic stain in American history, and it certainly is an historic stain. Despite the Shah's 37-year alliance with the United States in the Middle East, being described as America's most stable, reliable ally in the Middle East, growing to become one of the largest armies in the world. They had about the fifth most powerful military in the world at one time. And the Shah of Iran's ally, the United States, just undermined them. And notably, they dispatched General Haig to Iran to incapacitate the military. Now, I'm not giving my opinions. You'll notice I'm quoting sources here and giving the dates and where these quotes are made. Carter himself admitted to following the duplicitous advice of the American ambassador Sullivan, who was his choice. Your personnel is your policy. If you've got an ambassador giving duplicitous advice, you should probably replace him. He was a sympathizer of the pro-Mossadegh forces, according to Carter's own memoirs. American officials later condemned Carter's policies as deceitful and Sullivan's views as dangerously misguided. Again, I think that's too kind. Later, Brzezinski acknowledged that the political uprising against the Shah had American backing. And this ultimately led to his removal from power, which even Henry Kissinger admitted. It was the US government that forced the removal from power of the Shah of Iran, who couldn't have been toppled by the thugs in the street. It was their ally that betrayed him. This policy miscalculation not only caused the Shah's downfall, but plunged Iran into chaos, leaving it a victim of history. And Alexander Haig played a very key role in plunging Iran into chaos. He should know, because he's the one who advised, warned, cajoled, threatened, bribed, promised the Shah not to allow his military to use force against the rioters and the insurrectionists who were seeking to overthrow the country, which they could have done. They had the power to do it. They could have crushed this uprising and there would have been nothing heard about the Ayatollah Khomeini. But no, it was America, especially through the person of Alexander Haig, who went there to get them to quote them, to castrate the Iranian military, to incapacitate them, to restrain them, all the rest of it, to neuter them. So Carter's State Department displayed overt hostility towards the Shah. And that's Secretary of State Brzezinski's report. The Shah soon realized neither Carter nor the United States had any intention of supporting him. And he described America's policy as delusional. Again, that's too kind. But that's according to Sullivan's memoirs. The Carter administration repeatedly instructed its ambassador, warned the Shah about human rights issues. You know, your human rights issues, your police have bashed someone over the head for murdering people and things like this, and for planting bombs and for causing riots, and some of your secret police are torturing these terrorists to get information to try and save lives. And these human rights issues were of great concern. But of course, as President Reagan points out, the American government had no concern for the human rights abuse of the Soviet Union or of the Ayatollah's terrorists, for that matter. It's always selective. You know, betray our allies, appease our enemies. History since recorded Carter's administration as confused, hypocritical, and paralyzed in the face of Iran's escalating crisis. And that from Michael Leedon's Failure in Iran book. At the height of the turmoil, the Shah was abandoned, and Carter lacked a true understanding of the crisis or of its catastrophic consequences. Well, that's charitable to assume he lacked understanding. He failed to make sound decisions, is true, but maybe he intended to betray his ally. He did not grasp the irreversible damage his policies caused, said Brzezinski, who was a key player in the betrayal of Iran, by the way. Sullivan advised Carter to demand that the Shah leave Iran immediately and to align with Khomeini. This was the turning point. When America persuaded the Shah to leave Iran, the forces inside Iran perceived that they'd won. He's still in exile. They didn't think of it like the Shah was told, just temporarily to let things cool down. It didn't cool down. The US State Department lied to get him to leave the country because that gave an impression of victory to the revolutionaries who then swept all in front of them, especially as the Iranian army came to the conclusion of we being abandoned, we being betrayed. And so many decided to switch or to restrain themselves or not to use the force they should have used. And so getting the Shah to leave Iran was a key element in betraying the country. You should never listen to duplicitous traitors, backstabbers like the US State Department. I do hope that President Trump drains the swamp, and that means like firing virtually everybody in the State Department. I've been to Foggy Bottom, the State Department. I've been to their South Africa desk, so-called. And you know, you walked into the South Africa desk, And SWAPO posters on the walls, and ANC posters, and Clench Fist, and ZANU-PF, and Aluta Continua, and Falimo, and all the commerce things. And sitting at desk is a big black woman with dyed blonde hair and a nose ring. And then you see some little scared mousy white man running around there who looked like he was just there to be chased and shout at everyone else. And these angry-looking rappers and thugs and gangsters. This was the South Africa desk in the US State Department. I mean, no wonder their policies are like they are when you look at the kind of people they've employed. But the poor Shah, he said the worst thing he ever did was trust Carter and listen to America. Meanwhile, the United States intelligence agencies, according to the French Interior Minister, was disorganized, ignoring one of his warnings. But again, I think they're too kind if they think they're making mistakes. Because as Jonas Savimbi said, you can't make the same make 20 times and not have a hidden agenda. Notably, the CIA failed to predict the 1979 upheaval or the disastrous rise of the mullahs in Iran. How could they have missed it? I mean, I think even a blind monkey would have seen this coming. Cementing Carter's role as the key figure in the fiasco. All too nice to call it a fiasco, it's more like a betrayal. And Carter's policies were, quote unquote, unrealistic, clumsy, short-sighted, indecisive, full of contradictions, causing global repercussions. Just think right now, you still have the case of Iran being a threat to stability in the Middle East. Iran has shot, what, over 1,000 missiles into Israel? At least. And they've done a whole lot more. They've funded Hezbollah, Hamas, they've done all kinds of evil things. They were heavily involved in funding and supporting the 7 October attacks in 2023. So all this you can date all the way back to Jimmy Carter betraying a stable American ally in Iran and supporting the Shah's enemy, the Ayatollah. So Jimmy Carter's treatment of the Shah during his illness, he developed cancer. And we don't know what causes cancer, but stress certainly aggravates it. And it would seem that being betrayed and losing his kingdom must have been awfully burdensome to the poor Shah, and the Shah certainly went down very fast. He died shortly after being betrayed and getting cancer and leaving the country. And the way the Americans treated him while he was sick was very inhumane. It was Carter who, amongst all the world leaders, quickly deemed Khomeini a sacred figure, quote unquote, describing him as a religious, moderate leader. I mean, this sounds like Hillary Clinton describing the Muslim Brotherhood, some of the worst terrorists in the Middle East, as a force for peace and moderation in the Middle East. So how can you be that stupid? I'm sorry, I just see this as treacherous. The ties between Khomeini and Carter before 1979 became clear to all, said a BBC report. So I've quoted my sources. These aren't even my quotes and my ideas. I'm just quoting authorities like Brzezinski, top figures in the whole figure at the time, and they said the Shah was betrayed by America. The Iranian Tosha newspaper published an interview with the French President Gaspard d'Estaing, who said the United States rang the death knell for the Shah's rule because Carter had no hope for the regime's survival. And when Khomeini orchestrated the hostage crisis, remember they seized the American embassy, which is meant to be sovereign territory, a great international crime. They seized the embassy, they took civilians hostage, they blindfolded them, they chained them, they did mock executions, had them kneeling and pointing guns and cocking guns and back the necks and all sorts of things to humiliate them, cause them trauma, and they were locked up for, what, 444 days? Interestingly, Carter's response was to write a pleading letter to Ayatollah, then to resort to prayers, quote unquote. Finally, he sent a rescue mission. He sent the Green Berets in, but he put such restrictions on them that they very quickly had inadequate aircraft. One crashed, another smashed into a petrol tanker, an absolute disaster, and absolutely shocking that the Americans couldn't orchestrate an effective rescue of their own hostages. But at the same time, the German GSG-9, French Truppenrein, they successfully rescued all their hostages in Somalia in 1976. The Israeli commandos rescued all their hostages in Entebbe Airport, Uganda, in 1976. But the Americans failed to rescue their hostages in Iran in 1980. and respect for America under Carter plummeted to unprecedented depths. I don't think America has ever been as despised and as weak as it was under the time of Jimmy Carter. Carter's moralizing, cloaked in popularism, often bordered on naivety, said Time magazine. Again, too kind. He claimed to act in the name of God, said the Herald Tribune, but he appeared out of touch with reality. Well, that would just mean he's stupid, but it's more likely he's treacherous. You know, he wasn't an outsider. He was an insider. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was one of the people on the inside. He was probably part of the Illuminati and a whole lot. So I don't think that Jimmy Carter was as naive as they make out, although that's the impression he gave. The late Shah harshly criticized Carter, admitting that his gravest mistake was following American advice, which led to the release of murderous terrorists who later orchestrated more violence. And the Shah astutely questioned the American ambassador Sullivan, asking, why is the CIA so intensely active against me? Being an American ally, that's a good question to ask. Why was the Central Intelligence Agency working to overthrow America's ally in the Middle East, the Shah of Iran? The Shah foresaw the devastating catastrophe that was unfolding, and Carter, wielding his political and intelligence apparatus, deliberately supported the opposition forces to pressure the Shah. And later, the CIA director confirmed the Shah's concerns. In Newsweek, in 1979, the CIA director admitted, had we shown more vigilance, America's policy during Iran's turmoil could have been different. No jokes. Yes, it could have and should have been very different. I grew up under the delusion that America was the leader of the free world, and I grew up under the delusion that there were secret agents like James Bond working to keep the world safe from dictators. And then I met those people. I actually had to go and meet people like folks at the CIA and the DIA and MI6 in Britain and speak to the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, Security Committee people. I spoke with the Africa experts, literally sitting in Washington, D.C., speaking to the Defense Intelligence Agency Africa expert. I mentioned having Minister Mbari. He said, oh, that's the Zimbabwe port. I said, no, Zimbabwe's a landlocked country. Beira is in Mozambique. He said, no, Beira is Zimbabwe's port. I said, they use it, but it's not in Zimbabwe. And here's this Africa expert arguing with me. I said, when were you last in Africa? No, he's never been there, but he's the Africa expert. I said, well, I've been there. I've been in Beira. I can assure you it is not in Zimbabwe. I mean, really, that you've got to have discussions like this with people who, these are the ones making the policies for the free world, and realize, you know, we're on our own. Don't think that there's somebody in Washington or London who's actually trying to protect us from evil forces. They are often the evil forces themselves, to be honest. And the Shah's fall was orchestrated. This was as random as a sniper's bullet. It was totally planned. Now, Obama and Biden have followed Jimmy Carter's disastrous doctrine in the Middle East. American authors have frequently criticized Carter's populist and controversial behavior. And that's a comment from a presidential Secret Service agent who wrote his memoirs. And while Carter's now gone, his policies live on in what can be described as Carter 2, Barack Hussein Obama, and Carter 3, Biden. Because Biden and Obama followed the Carter doctrine in the Middle East. Perhaps his death will mark the end of these misguided policies, especially as we've got the Trump revolution right now, and we certainly hope they succeed in ending these useless, worthless, no-win wars. But the world first faced the rise of Islamic radicalism during the Carter era, because he meddled and he caused the beginning of the rising of Islamic radicalism. Interestingly, Jimmy Carter authored a book called Our Endangered Values, in which he criticized President Bush's disastrous wars in the Middle East, which is fair comment, but the Bush wars were actually following the Carter Doctrine, which he established, which regards the Persian Gulf as a vital U.S. interest requiring military intervention to maintain the status quo. Any threat to the status quo in the Persian Gulf requires U.S. military intervention. That is the Carter Doctrine. He started it. And now, to criticize the Bushes is fair enough, but not from Carter, because Carter's the one who started the policy that they were following. Ideas do have consequences. American foreign policy often affects believers in Africa and especially the Middle East. Some eulogies of Jimmy Carter have claimed, even small acts can change the world, which is true. And that Jimmy Carter's actions touched many lives. Well, that's also true, but disastrously so in the case of Jimmy Carter. His intentions may have been good. I don't grant that. I'm just saying maybe his intentions were good. But his consequences have been consistently catastrophic. It was Jimmy Carter's government meddling in Afghanistan early in 1979 that provoked the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in Christmas of 1979, which then led to America doing a mega overreaction of banning all American athletes from taking part in the Moscow Olympics in 1980, which, what does got to do with sports? Why would you bring politics into sports? Why would you punish sportsmen from participating for what they've prepared for years just because of your political failures? But American involvement in Afghanistan has become increasingly counterproductive and disastrous, especially for the local population. America might have smugly observed that the Russians got involved in a quagmire in Afghanistan, but then America probably got involved in a quagmire there too. They should have learned from history. You don't get involved in Afghanistan. When the British had a beef with Afghanistan, they marched the armies in, they burnt Kabul, and they marched right back to India. Now that's the intelligent thing to do. If you've got to have a fight with Afghanistan, have your fight and get out. But to stay there for years, insane. The British Empire couldn't do it, the Russian Empire couldn't do it, and the American Empire couldn't do it either. You can't fight in Afghanistan and expect to win. The country is so rugged, and the people there are so tenacious, they will fight, fight, fight. A friend was traveling in Afghanistan some time back, and he said next to him were some of these guys sitting there with their rifles, and they're sort of jostling over the bad roads. This is back in the 60s. And he is from Australia, and he said, they asked him, where are you from? Australia. And that means nothing to this guy said, where are you from? So after a while he said, Britain. He said, Britain, Lee Enfield rifle, #1. And everyone of us, Lee Enfield rifle, #1. And, they've got Lee Enfield rifles from the Brits. This is, really great. We love it that the Brits came here. We upgrade our weapons from old muskets to Lee Enfield rifles. And I suppose after that there were Russians, AK-47, #1. And I don't know what the Americans bought in, but whatever the Americans are using, they're probably very happy for that too. Americans left them a lot of weapons. But Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. And yes, the poor Soviets got stuck into Afghanistan. What a mess. You don't win in Afghanistan. It's just a total mess. And so Jimmy Carter, despite being on kissing relationships with Brezhnev, he started the ball rolling with this catastrophic series of wars in Afghanistan. First the Russians, and then, of course, Taliban, Al-Qaeda that America aided. You know that Osama bin Laden, the one who's meant to have attacked America, he was armed and trained by the American CIA in Afghanistan. Okay, he was fighting the Russians at that time, so fair enough. But of course, the same training and weapons can now be used against the Americans, as it was. I think he was involved in blowing up the US embassy in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam after that. So Jimmy Carter should get more credit for the chaos in the Middle East. He started. And the Muslim radicalism that's grown up since then is a direct consequence of his meddling and kind of awakened the whole radical Islamic terrorism that has so changed and shaped the world, including the Muslim Brotherhood and even the Ayatollahs, Shiite loonies in Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter helped fund and aid them and train these people. So Carter, too, Obama, was aiding the people who are burning churches and killing Copts in Egypt, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood. We do not negotiate with terrorists, says Obama, we finance them. And this is Egyptian humor. Egyptians love Americans, but your Obama is supporting terrorism. This is exactly what the people complaining about in downtown Cairo. Obama supports terrorism, which he did. Stop supporting terrorists. It was Jimmy Carter who decided to give away the Panama Canal, which the United States had built at a cost of many lives. I think 38,000 died building the Panama Canal. And America paid more for the Panama Canal than any other project in the history of America. And they paid a fortune over and over, and they even paid Panama to keep it. And then Jimmy Carter decided to give Panama Canal away to the government of Panama, which is a dictatorship, let's face it. Not like it's some kind of pristine democracy like Switzerland or something like that. But worse than that is they're charging America, even American Navy, a fortune in, tollgate fees. But we're talking about $500,000 for one vessel to pass through sort of tollgate fees. I remember when they built the Huguenot Tunnel up on the N1 going north, and I first passed by my motorbike and had to pay R2 to go through. And I thought, that's a lot. Well, R2 was a lot at that stage. We could do a lot of 1980 with R2. I could fill up a tank of a bucky for R5. So, R2 was a lot of money paid. They were saying, but the fees will go down as we pay for the toll gate, and then when it's paid for, the toll gates will be dismantled and moved away. Now that's 1980, which is a long time ago, but not so long that I can't remember, that they said this was temporary. And the toll gates have just become another way of government stealing from you. It's an absolute rip-off. Well, America, who built the canal, is paying toll gates on using the canal. Now, the Panama Canal is actually quite a magnificent naval choke point. It was built at phenomenal expense and effort. And it is quite clever. It makes use of some natural waterways, but then it's had to, of course, hack through some and dynamite the way through some mountains as well. And to get from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, the Panama Canal is absolutely essential. Because if you go around Cape Horn at the south of South America, it's often in storms and many a ship's been wrecked there. It's not only far, it's actually seriously dangerous for shipping too. So at a Biblical Worldview conference in Colorado, 2010, one of the speakers claimed Barack Hussein Obama is the worst president in American history. Well, during discussion time, I ventured to challenge her, stating, well, he's only been in power for 2 years. It might turn out so, but have you considered Jimmy Carter's foreign policy legacy? And so I gave a bit of a rundown on the trail of treachery of Jimmy Carter. And while I was cataloging Carter's foreign policy catastrophes, Professor David Noble walked up, put his hand on my shoulder and said, Peter, you're wrong. When it comes to damage done, no president's done worse than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At Yalta, he betrayed the whole of Eastern Europe and ultimately 1/3 of the world's population under the most oppressive dictatorship in history, the Soviet Union. And here you can see FDR laughing with his buddy Joseph Stalin, what he called Uncle Joe. According to one State Department official, FDR's policy was to give Stalin everything he wanted, everything he asked for, and asked nothing in return, quote unquote. And there you can see the Soviet Union was not just given Eastern Europe, they were given Central Europe too, all the way to East Germany and Czechoslovakia, into the heart of Europe. Absolutely insane. Damning 150 million Christians betrayed in these countries into the hands of the worst dictatorship in history in the name of being the arsenal for democracy in a war for freedom and democracy and so on. The hell that these people went through. And you can read Tortured for Christ of Richard Morenbund, Brother Andrew's God Smuggler, Bill Bathman's going through, just to get a bit of a feel of the cost on the ground for the people. When I started going to Eastern Europe, I met people who were like, you betrayed us. I said, what do you mean I betrayed you? Well, you English, you Americans, you foreigners. And I'm sorry to say, I couldn't even say South Africa wasn't part of that because South Africa provided the gold to pay for the Lend-Lease that sent all the weapons to the Soviet Union. Not voluntarily, because our Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister James Barry Hertzog, refused to declare war on Germany. He said, this isn't our fight. It's nothing to do with South Africa. In fact, it's nothing to do with Britain either. There's a fight in Poland. And by the way, Russia is invading Poland from the east. Why are we only declaring war on one of the aggressors if the concern is Poland? And as a result, Jan Smuts, General Jan Smuts, staged a coup. Most South Africans don't know that we had a coup here. And the government was replaced. No referendum, no elections. Jan Smuts, who had lost the last 5 elections against James Barry Hertzog, just took power, and the first order of business was ship all the gold in South Africa to Simonstown to be put on board the USS Quincy to be shipped off to New York. And when FDR had his hands on the South African gold, then he opened the floodgates of the arsenal for democracy to ship millions and billions of dollars worth of weaponry to the Soviet Union, which saved the Soviet Union at its key time. So it's true, yes, this trio of criminals Stalin, Churchill, FDR betrayed the Christians of Eastern Europe into the hands of the Soviet Union. And sadly, South Africa helped fund it. Not that we were ever asked. Well, it's not even in our history books. Parliament wasn't asked. Something Smuts did because Churchill asked him to do it, because FDR asked Churchill for it. And Christians all over the world were shot in the back, basically, by the Marxists, and that was the war for freedom and democracy. Now, from the back of the hall, a voice rang out, and it all began with Abraham Lincoln. Well, here's the Lincoln Memorial in a temple, and he's on an imperial Roman throne with the fascist symbols, his hands on them. And the words above in marble says, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people, for whom he saved the Union, Abraham Lincoln will live forever." I mean, absolute idolatrous terminology, literally. And of course, the United States of America is the way they used to speak about it before the war between the states. Since Lincoln, it's the United States of America is. It used to be the United States of America are, because it was plural. A United States of America, not a United States of America. And he grew the federal government colossally. And from that time, America's been, the sovereignty doesn't rest in the local state, the sovereignty rests in the federal government, in the Washington, D.C. bureaucracy. And then another person suggested Woodrow Wilson should be considered as a serious candidate for one of the worst presidents in American history. He introduced federal income tax, and he opened up the Federal Reserve Bank, which, as Stephen Mitford Goodson points out, it's not federal, it has no reserves, and it's not a bank. And he also said South African Reserve Bank is not South African, it has no reserves, it isn't a bank. And it's Woodrow Wilson who dragged America into the First World War, launched the propaganda industry, which later became public relations or PR, and he played a leading role in launching the League of Nations, which was a forerunner to the United Nations. So I can't leave Jimmy Carter there. He also sowed the seeds of the civil war in South Sudan. On 9th of July 2011, the youngest country in Africa in the world was born, South Sudan. And this is a major answer to an extraordinary campaign of prayer and action, which I was intimately involved with. In fact, I wrote and published 3 editions of Faith on Fire in Sudan, took in the film crews who produced films like Sudan, Dead and Holocaust, Terrorism and Persecution, 3 Days in Sudan. These played a major role in bringing about independence for South Sudan and support for the independence. And I conducted over 1,200 meetings within Sudan, more than 1,000 public meetings overseas, including radio and TV, to promote the independence of South Sudan, winning people like Franklin Graham to the cause, who was able to put pressure on his friend George Bush Jr. Everyone expected the newly independent South Sudan to be declared a Christian country, like Zambia. Our whole theme was, let my people go, all for separation. We need independence, peace, and prosperity. And the people voted, and first time they ever had a vote, they sounded the trumpet for independence, and 9th of July 2011, South Sudan became a free and independent country. But although we expected it to be Christian, Jimmy Carter used his presidential prestige to persuade the new president, Salva Kiir, that this must be a secular country. No prayer, no minister of science, no Christian curriculum, no, the United Nations must provide your textbooks to your school, UNESCO and so on. There was so much hope, and the people in Sudan felt betrayed, and in many ways, Jimmy Carter is the one who derailed it. The promise of this newly independent country, leading to a new civil war, mind you. Ex-President Jimmy Carter managed to persuade the new president of South Sudan resist all calls from his own citizens to include Christian amendments to the Constitution. And no prayer in Parliament. Carter used his elder statesman status to assist South Sudan. He insisted it must be constituted as a secular state. Worse than this, he sowed the seeds for a new civil war in South Sudan by demanding that President Salva Kiir, on the right, include his arch-rival Riek Machar in his government as vice president. But Riek Machar was much worse than just a rival. He was the surrogate for the National Islamic Front government of Sudan. Machar and his SSIM army had been supplied by the Sudan Armed Forces of dictator Omar al-Bashir. In fact, Mashar's SSIM killed more Sudanese civilians, committed more atrocities, slaughtered more cattle, caused more scorched earth devastation than even the Arab National Islamic Front government of Sudan. At the first anniversary of independence in South Sudan, the president, Salva Kiir, reported 5 billion Sudanese pounds was missing from the public treasury. 5 billion pounds. How did they have so much money? Well, sadly, oil was discovered. And the next year, he can only report on 200 million pounds being returned. Now, considering Riek Machar ran the oil exports, he is the first suspect for the missing money. So, at the second anniversary of independence, the president fired his whole government. And that included the vice president. So the vice president used his half of the presidential guard with his men, who were Nuer tribesmen of SSIM origin, and they started a new civil war. And incredibly, even after ceasefire was negotiated, the US government insisted that this kleptomaniac embezzler had to be reinstated as the vice president. Now, I noticed America getting a bit unhappy at the thought that foreign governments were interfering in their elections. The British government certainly tried. Apparently the Russian government might have tried. We don't know if that's true. But what do you think of American governments interfering in the local elections of a people who want to have a Christian country? We cannot even say Carter's disastrous foreign policies ended in 1980 with his electoral defeat by Ronald Reagan. Carter's continued to meddle in international affairs to an unprecedented level. I don't think any previous president has ever done more after his presidency. Now, building houses for Habitat for Humanity is commendable, and that's something good Carter did. Apparently built like 2,000 houses for the poor, which is great, but that doesn't compensate for the amount of lives wrecked for the wars and the terrorism which he financed. Incredibly, after that ceasefire, they still insisted that this Mashar's got to be reinstated, and this happened a couple of times. So we need to still pray for South Sudan. They're free of Northern Sudan, but they're not free of the corruption that has come in at inception. It's just remarkable, the interference. Now, during Obama's disastrous presidency, a billboard appeared in America with a smiling picture of President Jimmy Carter declaring, well, at least I can't be called America's worst president anymore. And of course, Obama was also called Carter too. So US foreign policy often affects believers in Africa and the Middle East. During the 4 years of the presidency of Jimmy Carter, 13 countries fell to communism, including Nicaragua, who were American allies. In most cases, they didn't just fall to communism, they were actually betrayed into the hands of communist revolutionaries. It was a high foreign policy goal of Jimmy Carter's presidency to force the people of Rhodesia to hand over to Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF thugs armed and trained by Red China. And here, you can just see the body language, Jimmy Carter and Robert Mugabe. I mean, they look like they're ready to embrace and kiss, don't they? So Ian Smith said in his book, The Great Betrayal, we were never beaten by our enemies. We were betrayed by our friends. And like first and foremost up there, Jimmy Carter's up there, along with Harold Wilson of Britain. These were the backstabbing scum who betrayed a great country like Rhodesia, the breadbasket of Africa, a country with the highest educational standards in the continent, the lowest illiteracy rate, the highest literacy rate, highest employment, lowest unemployment in the continent, virtually insignificant crime rate. It was a country that was a really magnificent country of civilization, high civilization, attacked on all sides by the Soviets and by the Red Chinese-backed terrorists, and brave little country made a strong stand, not beaten by its enemies, betrayed by its friends. And what a kleptomaniac lunatic Rob Mugabe became. Became multi-billionaire while his people got poorer and poorer. Those Zimbabwe dollars, you can see we've got some examples in our cabinets here of not just $1 million notes, but $1 billion notes. And I've got a $100 trillion note, which couldn't buy half a loaf of bread. But those money isn't valuable, not worth trying to break in to steal those. $100 trillion notes is not going to buy you anything because it's Marxist money. And so Americans removed Jimmy Carter from the presidency over 44 years ago. But the long-suffering people of Zimbabwe are still stuck with Carter's legacy in the form of Mugabe's murderous ZANU-PF dictatorship, now under ED or Mnangagwa, who is his handpicked successor. And so under the red dictatorship of Mugabe, people were getting beaten up in the streets. In this case, this is Samora and Michelle Avenue, main street in Harare, getting whipped by police with a boot on the neck. Or these women getting beaten for praying outside a government building. And land invasions, expropriation without compensation. 5,000 commercial farmers who produced most of the food, produced most of the foreign currency, most of the exports, but their farms were invaded by these thugs, whipped up by Mugabe, and so we should still be praying for Zimbabwe, one of the casualties of history of Carter's legacy. On a positive note, no countries fell to communism during the 8 years of Ronald Reagan's presidency. In fact, countries started to be freed from communist oppression. And Ronald Reagan put freedom on the offensive. He supported the resistance movements in communist countries like Solidarity in Poland. And he helped the UNITA freedom fighters in Angola and Renamo in Mozambique. And he helped bring down the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. And the collapse of communism throughout Eastern Europe in 1989 brought about a new era of religious freedom and missionary activity that had previously been inconceivable. As one politician observed, there's nothing the communists despise more than weakness. There's nothing they respect more than strength. Well, America was despised during Jimmy Carter's era, but America was respected under Ronald Reagan. During the Clinton era, we witnessed and experienced a steady increase in violent persecution of Christians throughout the Muslim world. It's in the 1990s that radical Muslim regimes like the National Islamic Front governments in Sudan began systematic terror bombings of churches, hospitals, and schools. And at that time, I experienced and documented artillery bombardments, aerial bombardments, rocket bombardments while ministering in churches in Sudan. And that's in some of the videos we mentioned. But as America began fighting back after the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001, toppling the radical Taliban in Afghanistan, the bombing of churches in northern Nigeria and in South Sudan stopped. And we enjoyed a period of relative peace, stability, as radical Muslim regimes were put onto the defensive. But then after Obama became president of the United States, there was an unmistakable escalation of violent attacks of Christians worldwide, particularly in the Muslim Middle East. Literally hundreds of churches bombed, burned throughout northern Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, Iraq in the Obama years. Just in northern Nigeria alone, where I've ministered, over 1,000 attacks on churches, with 17,000 Christians killed, just in a 5-year period between 2010 to 2015 by Boko Haram jihadist terrorists. Most Americans probably don't think foreign policy when they vote for the president. They're normally thinking domestic economy. But believers in Africa and the Middle East would earnestly entreat our brethren in America, please always seriously consider the foreign policy implications of your votes. Lives are at stake. As I wrote in my article, Ronald Reagan saved lives in Angola. There are literally millions of people alive and free today because of the far-sighted, courageous foreign policies of President Ronald Reagan. And I'd say people are alive today because of Donald Trump's policies as well. And hopefully wars will be ended in the next few months as Donald Trump gets control over the US foreign policy, hopefully by firing everybody in the whole of Foggy Bottom or State Department in the USA. But all ideas have consequences. We reap what we sow. There are consequences for every action. We must continue to pray that our Christian brethren in America will be much in prayer and seek the wisdom of God as they approach any future elections. We need to be faithful to God's word. We need to be effective in God's service as we seek to reclaim our countries for Christ. Like Zambia, which was once communist, which now is asking us to help them set up a chaplain's training school in Livingston. We need to lay solid biblical foundations for reformation and earnestly pray for spiritual revival. As an African, I'll always be grateful to Ronald Reagan playing a key role to save lives in Angola. In the 1980s, I made multiple mission trips into war-torn Angola. At the time, there were 50,000 Cuban troops in the country. And the communists attacked, destroyed many churches. MiG-23s, Mi-23 Hind helicopter gunships were terrorizing the villages in Angola. and are documented numerous of these atrocities, including the strafing of villages, schools, and churches. And just think of our Sudan films, Celebrity Terrorism, Islam books, Islam Rising DVD that we played a role in. And this is what exterior decorating looked like in Sudan. Your home too could look like this. Sorry, Angola. This is in Angola, north of Ruacana. And you can see, okay, you can tell the AK-47 holds some 12.7s. You can see where the RPGs went through the wall. Well, UNITA freedom fighters of Jonas Savimbi were standing and fighting against the communists, being armed and trained by the South Africans, mind you. And the Soviet weaponry was being used by Cubans and others to bombard the people in Angola. In 1987, I remember hearing Ronald Reagan's speech carried on BBC Africa service by shortwave radio. So you're sitting in the bush around a campfire, trying to heat up our old fire buckets to be able to have some hot chocolate or something at night. And there we hear Ronald Reagan's voice. We're going to send Stinger missiles to the UNITA freedom fighters in Angola. There was a long silence. We were all thinking, did we just hear what we think we heard? I mean, it sounded bizarre. Why would he be talking about us? There I am with UNITA in the middle of the bush. And one of us said after a while, that would be nice, but will they do it? In fact, they did. We saw the Stinger missiles arrive, and I've got some pictures here of the Soviet weaponry shot down. Bombing of villages and schools and churches came to an end. So without a doubt, Ronald Reagan saved lives in Angola. And so here are some of the results of good use of tax money. At last, US tax money doing something useful, shooting down Hind helicopter gunships, Mi-8s. Here's an Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship, totaled, not going anywhere. Well, there's a lot of documentation to show what Jimmy Carter's legacy was. Ian Smith can testify to it, the Shah's story testifies to it, and then Anthony Sutton, Professor Anthony Sutton documented in The Best Enemy Money Can Buy that America under Carter was funding the military buildup of the Soviet Union and Red China with technology and with money, and selling American corn to Russia cheaper than the Americans could make it, and enabling therefore to direct a lot of the economy from agriculture to weapons because the Americans are feeding the Soviets. So you can get a lot of documentation on this and the articles on Jimmy Carter and Angola, Sudan, Iran on the Frontline Mission SA.org website.